The Obama administration braces for an explosive report on the Bush administration's use of torture.
More than a decade after instituting new harsh interrogation techniques, extensive details about their use were revealed.
Brutal techniques that went well beyond the limits of the law.
Stripped naked and diapered. One detainee chained to a wall for 17 straight days in a standing position.
Leading to questions about whether the CIA had gone too far and calls for accountability.
Should CIA officials be prosecuted?
But in 2004, the Justice Department did charge one man with such a crime.
American authorities have arrested a CIA contractor.
He is accused of beating a detainee with a flashlight.
Pissarro was indicted on 4 counts of assault.
And they told me that they were investigating me for torture. I was floored.
What does this case tell us about how America's war on terror was interpreted on the ground?
I wasn't hired to be nice to these terrorists. I was there to get a job done. I was there to elicit the truth and keep moving.
In the summer of 2003, U.S. forces were heavily engaged in efforts to root out the Taliban in Afghanistan. David Pissarro, a former Army Ranger, signed up to go to the front lines as a contractor for the CIA.
I went to work for the agency as a paramilitary officer to combat terrorism.
Among his responsibilities was to find an insurgent who had been harassing a remote U.S. outpost in Afghanistan with rocket fire.
It came under fire quite often. We were unsure who it was coming from.
Intelligence received from a nearby village soon focused on one man, a farmer named Abdul Wali. To help find Wali, investigators turned to the provincial governor and his 18-year-old son, an Afghan-American named Haider Akbar.
Abdul Wali reached out to my father and, said that he's not involved and he'd like to clear his name. Abdul Wali was very scared. So my father sent me along with him. We were driving down towards the American base. I was very assuring to Abdul Wali because I was, American myself. And knowing what I knew of my country, I felt very confident.
Upon arriving at the base, Wali and Akbar met with U.S. investigators.
We sat down, there's a fan above us, and we started the discussion. And pretty quickly, Dave Pissarro's behavior made me very uncomfortable. The way I would describe it is like, I almost felt like it was a guy that felt like he was playing a role in a movie. Let's do this. Who are you, Abdul Wali?
Akbar says he felt uncomfortable, refused to translate anymore, and left the base.
Even when you're just translating Pissarro's words to Abdul Wali are mine, and I don't want to be saying these words to him.
Wali was then taken to the base detention center.
I had an old rickety broken wooden chair, and so I ended up taking that and took a board, and when I walked into his little cell, I started screaming and yelling, "Get over here," and started slapping the board on the chair and broke the chair, all in an attempt to try to frighten him. And I believe it worked because when they took that sandbag off his head under my direction, he had one eyeball in the center of his head about that big. So I realized he was probably going to take us seriously from that point forward.
Pissarro said that he had never been taught how to interrogate a suspect, but learned in the Army what to do if he was captured by the enemy.
The training is very intense. Stress positions, total humiliation, because that's the only thing I could fall back on. I didn't want him sleeping any more than 2 to 3 hours a night. One of the stress positions was something called the air chair, and that's just hold his arms out until he decided he would change his demeanor. Every time he would sit there, he would do this, and he would drop his arms to his elbows. Well, that's not the air chair. And then I would tap his arms to tell him to get his arms back up, underneath. At one point, he lurched out after me, and I slapped him. It was just a quick response. My hands were right here, and it was just to get him off of me. Is that assault? It could be construed as assault, but in the war on terror in Afghanistan, in Asadabad, that's not assault.
After 3 days of interrogation, Wali collapsed. Despite efforts to revive him, he died. No autopsy was performed.
I'm not going to say anybody lost any sleep when Abdul Wali died. I didn't, and I still don't.
This was a man who had turned himself in voluntarily. It wasn't the traditional way that people kind of justify torture, the ticking time bomb situation. This was not a situation like that.
2 years earlier, after September 11th, Americans were consumed by the fear that terrorists would strike again.
Like ticking time bombs, set to go off without warning.
Alberto Mora, who was general counsel of the Navy at the time, recalls with dismay how quickly pressure built in Washington to rewrite the rules.
There was a feeling that through their sheer brutality, the Al-Qaeda members who were responsible for that and were plotting further attacks had essentially opted out of the human race and were subject to almost any kind of treatment that could be leveled against them.
In mid-2002, with Osama bin Laden still at large and other terror attacks feared, the CIA asked the administration for permission and legal justification to use so-called enhanced interrogation techniques against suspected terrorists in certain situations.
We knew this was going to be a big step, and we all agreed this was the right thing to do for this country. We were comfortable in the application of these enhanced techniques to the most serious, the worst of the worst. There was a procedure put in place, safeguards had to be met.
But Pissarro, who wasn't authorized to use enhanced interrogation techniques, says the administration's attitude was interpreted more broadly on the ground.
America was angry, and they believed that the CIA and the military would actually be able to go out and do their jobs now with maybe a little more relaxed procedures. That was my belief. That's kind of what's filtered down to us.
After Wali's death, Pissarro's contract wasn't renewed, and he returned to a civilian job at Fort Bragg. Then, in April of 2004,
it was American soldiers serving as military police at Abu Ghraib who took these pictures.
In the wake of Abu Ghraib came new reports, including that other suspicious deaths of CIA detainees were already under investigation by the CIA. Among them, Abdul Wali's.
The third CIA prisoner died last June in Afghanistan, also after a severe beating.
7 weeks later, Pissarro was arrested.
This morning, a grand jury in Raleigh, North Carolina, has indicted a contractor working on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency for brutally assaulting an Afghan detainee.
I was floored. I was working for the government, combating terrorism, with the authority to kill terrorists, the training to kill terrorists, and the direction given to kill terrorists. And here they are arresting me for assault. I believe 100% that Abu Ghraib, when it kicked off and finally came to the public's awareness, they had to show that they were going to hold the CIA accountable, so they had me.
The Department of Justice portrayed Pissarro as an outlier, a man with a dangerous temper who was operating outside of CIA rules in his zeal to break Wali down.
One Special Forces officer testified earlier today that David Pissarro was, quote, red in the face, spit flying, yelling at this guy.
He was fired from the police department for beating someone up.
Pissarro's defense attorneys countered that their client was a patriot being prosecuted for just doing his job.
After 9/11, President Bush got on national television and said, not only are we going to go after the terrorists, but we're going to go after those that harbor the terrorists, and we will do so under any or with any means necessary. I can remember Dick Cheney saying the same thing in Coffer Black, the gloves are off. In other words, all the rules and regulations no longer applied.
I didn't find it too difficult to testify in the trial. I felt a sense of personal responsibility to be able to do whatever I can to figure out what exactly had happened. I think there's enough blame to go around. We were incredibly naive. There's some blame to be placed on the U.S. military for allowing an individual like Dave Pissarro to be in such a sensitive situation. And then I think that, of course, Dave Pissarro for actually, beating this man.
Jurors came back with a decision.
David Pissarro was convicted of beating Afghan farmer Abdul Wali.
Witnesses testified that Pissarro had repeatedly hit Wally with a flashlight and kicked him in the groin, and there was no conclusive evidence presented that Wally was a terrorist. Pissarro was sentenced and served more than 6 years in prison. Now out, he still maintains he did nothing wrong.
Anything that I did to Abdul Wali, none of that constitutes torture. In hindsight, I wouldn't have done anything different.
To some, this case showed that CIA interrogators were being held to strict standards. But in 2014, a Senate report revealed that Pissarro was far from the only interrogator to have stepped out of bounds, and it criticized the entire CIA interrogation program.
CIA interrogations of terror suspects after 9/11 went far beyond legal boundaries.
The interrogations did not produce intelligence that mattered.
Stress positions, standing sleep deprivation, nudity, and repeated waterboarding.
I try not to get into discussion about what is or what is not torture, because if you believe it's torture, there's nothing I can say to dissuade you of that. When I think about torture, it's broken bones, electric shocks, genitalia. It's pulling your teeth out with pliers. It's cutting off a limb. That's torture. Is waterboarding at the same level? I'd say probably not.
We've disfigured the definition of torture. We've also sought to shield those who are responsible both for the application of the torture and for the decision to apply torture. We've changed the definition, and we've dispensed with the concept of accountability.
Despite other detainee deaths during CIA interrogations, Pissarro remains the only interrogator connected to the CIA ever brought to task in an American court.
It's hard for me to have any sympathy for Dave. I'm more inclined towards finding out about these other cases and seeing who else needs to be punished for what they had done there.
Akbar says that what happened in that interrogation room has changed the course of many lives, including his own.
I was driving, we got ambushed. You can see the car's on fire.
During a visit to Afghanistan, unknown assailants fired on his car.
When I got back to Kabul, I began to receive calls from Abdul Wali's brother about the attack and taunts and things saying, you know, you managed to escape this time and I've been looking for you. I only knew Abdul Wali for 3 hours in my whole life. And now I have to deal with his brother for the rest of my life.